What to expect for the rest of the 2024 season. We're going to talk through some of the league's teams, kind of a quarter way or third of the way check-in. That's what we'll be talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find the Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. Shawn, we didn't really know what we wanted to talk about this week. We didn't have a clean topic. Last week, we did our first and second rounds of 2025 ADP over again. Sometimes you have the nice theme. Sometimes you have whatever we're going to do now. We were just joking. I couldn't get the intro right, and you were laughing and said, do you want to just do the show first and then the intro after, which we've done before and probably could have done. We're going to kind of work through it. The loose idea is that we wanted to check in with a look forward, check in on a lot of these different teams, what we think they are right now and what they're going to be. You just said to me, by way of an example of what we're kind of thinking through right before we went live, you quoted Derrick Henry's receiving under Todd Downing. We had been talking a little in the pre-show about Todd Downing taking over the play calling for the Jets. He also took over, not in season, but after Arthur Smith left Tennessee for Atlanta, Todd Downing was the offensive coordinator the next 2 years. I had said to you a little while ago that's when Tennessee's offense sort of fell off. And that's part of why people think of Arthur Smith as a pretty good offensive coordinator, is that he got that version of the Ryan Tannehill, Derrick Henry offense to be pretty successful in a way that once Todd Downing took over, it got a little worse. But you mentioned an intriguing note there that Derrick Henry had some of his best receiving under Todd Downing. Is that kind of a thing where we're just going to kind of think through some of the things? We got Drake Maye starting for the Patriots. We'll probably talk about them. We want to check in on some of the other teams, where they're at, where they're going. You mentioned the Chiefs earlier. We didn't get a chance to talk about them on the Sunday night show because they were on Monday night, but they are an interesting team to talk about right now. We got Kareem Hunt getting 28 touches. We got no Rashee Rice, and a lot going on there. So a lot of teams we can check in on, talk through, think about. How you doing?
Good. We have 4 pretty critical teams on the bye this week. The Dolphins, not as critical, obviously, with the Tua injury, but certainly a lot of meaningful fantasy names there. Even if you, like us, benched Jalen Waddle a week ago, the Chiefs will be on the bye, and they could come back out looking a little different. I thought that Andy Reid meant business on Monday night against the Saints in a way that I didn't necessarily feel like I had seen from him. It's just kind of reading into Juju Smith-Schuster having a big game. But he seemed like he wanted to eliminate any questions about what the Chiefs' offense was going to be in the aftermath of having lost Pacheco, lost Rashee Rice, whether or not they could still hold their own there. And that massive beatdown of the Saints, he seemed to be like, this is going to be a statement game. We're going to show that we are not just the best team in the NFL, but we're gapped from teams like the 49ers who are managing to blow games, teams like the Ravens and Bengals who, the Ravens escaped, but obviously still have some of their problems. I mean, it was a very frustrating game because what you want to see, if you're a Stealing Bananas listener, is you wanted to see Xavier Worthy do some of the things that we got from Travis Kelce and Smith-Schuster. But I thought that was encouraging. Just real quick, Ben, we also have the Rams with some names we like in terms of Kyren Williams on the bye. That'll hopefully allow them to get some of these receivers back that they want. And then the Minnesota Vikings, obviously, with Jefferson and Addison. Now Aaron Jones injured. Maybe that helps him. The bye comes at a good time for some of these players who are a bit banged up. But I was looking through my lineups, certainly lots and lots of people to replace, tons of injuries out there. And yet I'm pretty excited because I love the bye week stretch. It gives you a chance that if you drafted, quote, better after round 6, then this is your chance to show it. So lots of things going on. What jumps out to you?
A ton. I want to ask about what you meant by the Juju Smith-Schuster comment, because I'm not aware of your thoughts on that. I know you wrote a long piece this week about some of the games. You probably mentioned it there, but I wanted to get, so my read on the Chiefs was similar, that I mean, they are winning despite not playing particularly well and despite not having some of their best players, right? when I say not playing particularly well, that's not really fair, obviously, because they are playing well, but this was their best game of the year. Their first 4 games were they're 5-0 now, and it's easy to be like, well, yeah, they're really good. They're so dynamic, this, that, and the other thing. Okay, week 1, Isaiah Likely's toe barely hits the chalk, or that game was going to overtime. Week 2, they beat the Bengals with, I believe, what was it, a last-second field goal. They win by 1. They were down 2, a 51-yard field goal at expiration. Great kick from Harrison Butker, but he can certainly miss that as well. We know that's possible. Speaking of the Bengals, they lose because of a 53-yard field goal in overtime where they had an opportunity to do to the Ravens what the Chiefs had done to them a couple weeks ago. They're probably not loving the fact that the 50-plus yard field goal to win the game as time expired went in when they were on defense, and their holder couldn't even necessarily get the ball down when they were trying to kick it through on offense. You get the Falcons the next week. That one was a little bit more of like, yeah, they were out in front. They did lead. They were down early, but they did lead by the early part of the second half. We're up by 8. Falcons got an early fourth quarter field goal to cut it to 5. But the Falcons did have the ball late. They got it as far down as the Kansas City 13 and got a turnover on downs with under a minute left. Had a possibility of scoring with, less than a minute. And then you have Ken Mahomes lead the ensuing field goal drive, probably. I mean, that's one of those things. There's always too much time on the clock for Mahomes. KC, I would say, was well positioned in that game. Then the Chargers game, they win by 7, is one where it was tied 10-10. They eventually score in the fourth quarter and put it away, but it doesn't. They were down 10-0, in the first quarter, but that's one. All 4 of those games, one-score games, true one-score games, 7 points or fewer. The Saints game, they win by 13, and they win it, like you said, pretty convincingly. I thought the first half was really interesting. I loved the game plan as well. Kind of what you said that Reed wanted to kind of put a statement out there. Came out throwing to Kelsey, who's a guy we talked about, I think on maybe last week or on the Sunday night show or at some point, was going to have to be the answer here without Rice. He had 3 receptions on the first drive. That was clear that they were going to get back to really focusing on Travis Kelce, who people have been really concerned about. He's going to be one of the top 3 tight ends this year. It's just very evident to me in that sequence in the first drive there, that even though he started slow, like that ceiling is coming. And then the Worthy stuff, I was actually really encouraged by. I saw a stat that he got one of the highest rates of first read targets in this game. I was more encouraged watching the game by how often they had him in motion. They seemed to really be trying to get him on the move pre-snap and then running a lot of the like drag routes or over routes across the field. I felt like the Saints, once he went in motion, were almost trying to like bracket him as he moved through. And there was a couple spots where he did get open. The broadcast showed one where he ran kind of an over route and got through the defense and got left and was open. And Mahomes had sort of missed it. There was another where he did a motion and then kind of banana routed back out as he went up the field, back to the side that he was motioning from. And Mahomes was clearly trying to get it there, but some pressure got to him and he underthrew it a little bit, but there was a window to get the throw if it could have been there. Didn't have a big day receiving anything like that, but to me, it felt like the offense was a little bit more centered on him. And then maybe the defense was also somewhat centered on stopping him. And that was my read on the Juju stuff. So I was really intrigued by your Juju comment because I felt like, yeah, they looked fantastic throwing the ball with intent early. And then especially what they did in the second half, they're up 16-7 at half, but they're like, you can't score on us. And Kareem Hunt's running at least effectively. He if you look at like some of the like NFL pro stats, his rush yards over expected were in the negative, but he did have missed tackles forced. He was a lot of the short yardage stuff. He's still pretty good at making a guy miss and leaning forward, right? Like there was a 4th down carry where it looked like he might get stuffed, and he did a really nice little slide past the defender that could have hit him in the backfield to lean through and get a first down on, I believe it was a 4th and 1 or maybe a 3rd and 1. It was a short yardage carry in the field of play. Some of those little missed tackles were on good runs in close. It didn't go for big yardage, but they were good success rate type runs. Seems clear that he's going to be a guy that fits what they want, sort of the first rule, do no evil stuff.
Well, among the backs who got meaningful touches last week, Kareem Hunt was one of the highest graded in Sports Info Solutions points above average per attempt, coming in just behind Bigsby and Javonte Williams and James Conner. So, from another slightly different perspective that still is looking at all of the context, which I know is one of the things that the yards, over expected would be doing. But from a different perspective on that, I mean, SIS felt like he was fantastic. It's impossible to leave your own biases aside. When you have thoughts on a certain player, it's simply going to filter into how you watch the game, regardless if you're open to the idea of changing your mind, right? Sometimes what will happen is you're so sure about something and then you're wrong. You'll actually flip too far to try and make sure that you are being open to the idea that you could be wrong. Basically, I want to set that up because I've never been very high on Isaiah Pacheco, and I want to be fair to him in this next comment in just stipulating that so people know where I'm coming from. I thought that Kareem Hunt looked better in this game and gave the Chiefs a better chance if they're going to have a run-heavy nature to it, and if teams are going to force them to run. I thought Kareem Hunt looked better than Pacheco has looked, and that is at least backed up by this SIS stat.
I had a very similar take, and I wrote in Stealing Signals that I didn't write that he was better, but that he was successful in the ways that Isaiah Pacheco often looks good, where it's just always clear the defenses will invite the Chiefs to run on them, almost happy to give up 5 yards at times as long as it keeps the Chiefs from dropping back to pass. I guess I didn't write that as cleanly, but or as aggressively as I did. But I know in my notes I was like, this is like how Pacheco wins, right? It's the same thing. You were saying that you even thought he looked better, which I think is really interesting. But we've talked about that over the years. That
I don't think that Hunt has the same burst. There are going to be a few plays that maybe you don't get, and we talk about how those big plays are important. But Hunt at the point of contact is able to do what Pacheco isn't, and he's got better vision. And so when you put those two things together, I think there are going to be far less situations in which being really begged to run early in terms of these big first down plays where you're setting up what you want to do and then being in a bad situation because we got you to do what you wanted. You didn't really get anything. And sometimes you get that, 2nd and 7, and then you're like, well, they're asking us to run again and we can stay kind of ahead of the chains if we do it. I just thought that this will work to an extent with Kareem Hunt in a way that right. I think the Chiefs, and you talked about it over the first month, and a lot of that wasn't Pacheco, right? It's people like Carson Steele who are also not really giving you anything other than fumbles. I don't know. I was pretty encouraged by this performance. And it ties into something else that we kind of had, wanted to talk about, which is this idea of the running back stats and what they tell you. Something that has been a concern of mine over the last several years in terms of how people are thinking about this type of element are that stats that have a stickiness to them, have a predictive element to them. I think then people are taking to mean that means that such and such is going to definitely happen. And it's just a tool for you to understand probabilities, but it seems like the community is collapsing those probabilities down to very binary options for running backs. And it doesn't matter if the back is a declining star or someone who is just mediocre in general. Now, Kareem Hunt in the past was a declining star. I think he had reached the point in his career where when you're evaluating his 2023, you're not thinking about him as a declining star. You're thinking about him as a very average back where you want to see if he's still viable or not. And the stats from last season would suggest he wasn't very viable. But again, even within that, there is still so much room for players, especially in small samples, to do things that it doesn't seem like the community is necessarily allowing for. And you have a situation with like a Saquon Barkley or an Alvin Kamara where they hit on the top end of that. And people are like, oh, everyone's wrong. These guys weren't washed. I mean, Alvin Kamara right now is one of the highest scoring backs in the NFL. But at the conclusion of this game, then he is in a situation where Alvin Kamara is now one of only 2 backs in the NFL with at least 50 carries who's being held under 2 yards after contact and below a 10% evasion rate. Again, these are SIS numbers. We want to understand that certain things can happen even if a back is not doing the things that we said he wasn't going to do, right? There is a lot going on here in scheme and blocking and play calling and where the runner is and what their skills still are. And then it's just pure variance that to boil down a player's future to one specific stat, even if it's a good stat, is a problem.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways that stuff can be tricky, and we'll definitely get into it. With Hunt, I was so excited to hear that note from you just now about the Pacheco thing, because as we're talking about looking forward for these teams, I mean, what I was getting at with the play calling that I really enjoyed was the passing to take the lead early, but then the hammer coming out in the second half and being willing to actually run the ball effectively, like you were talking about. I mean, they ran Hunt the first 3 plays of the second half. They go to steal a little bit. They go back to Hunt. Ended up missing a field goal on that drive, but a lot of running the whole second half, basically forcing the Saints to prove that they could get back into the game, and then they scored quickly at that point and then continued to run effectively. And a lot of Hunt throughout that game. The player I was going to bring up is Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who I have got a ton of questions about when I bring up Hunt. And yes, he was not activated. His return window was opened and he's practicing. I wrote about him a little bit delicately this week. You have the PTSD stuff, and that's scary. Everything you just said, I think, is really interesting, because one of the things that's happening with the numbers as well, or the advanced stats, or all these things, and it's using numbers in service of narratives, I think, and then not actually being willing to adjust. Because when you look at stuff like Hunt, it's clear that he's doing enough right now, and yet there are a lot of people out there that are just unwilling to accept that Kareem Hunt's going to be the lead back for the Chiefs going forward. And I think that was clear, not necessarily clear before it actually happened, but I thought that was a lot more likely than I thought a lot of people did. I wrote about it 3 times the week before he got his first activation, because I was getting questions, and
you got him onto our guillotine team, which has helped us not have to be nervous as we work through. Well, he was in the last game here. We didn't have to be nervous because we weren't going to be chopped, but I'm very happy that we have him on there. I think that Kareem Hunt is going to be one of the most important players the rest of the way.
Yeah, he looks really important. And there's a lot of people that are just saying, well, CH is going to come back and take that. And again, it sounds like you're very much in agreement with this, but just to kind of talk through it a little bit delicately, there's a lot here from the mental health side for CH that he just needs to, we're just hoping that he gets out there and he practices and things are going well. But even if we assume that all of that is behind him, which it's not necessarily an assumption that we can make, but even if we can make that assumption and we want to purely judge him on a talent perspective, you go back to before all this stuff happened in the offseason, and we were talking about like Deneric Prince and a lot of people, because it wasn't clear that CH would be the number 2 because of all of the things that he hasn't been able to do when given the opportunities for the Chiefs in the past. What Kareem Hunt has done so far this year, apart from stacking it up against Pacheco, who is hurt, is better than what anything they've really ever gotten from CEH over an extended period of time. They're not going to rush CEH back to take Kareem Hunt's job. I just want to make that clear for anyone who's out there like stashing CEH. I think there are people that think that's what's going to happen.
I've been adding him back and forth to teams when I have room. Again, because I don't think it's settled. Samaje Perine is interesting, Ben, in that doesn't get a carry in this game. He does get a couple of targets. Hunt only gets 1 target. One of the things for CEH that I would be a little bit nervous about. Now, one of the other things that we have to mention is that offenses can evolve pretty quickly when you have slightly different personnel. But this is a game where 39 passes, only 3 of them go to Hunt and Perine, even though, I mean, those guys are arguably decent at that compared to, what they are as runners.
I think Perine's kind of done. I was pretty in on him. I was trying to convince you of stashing him in one of our teams in August. His inability to get on the field prior to Hunt and how quickly now Hunt has consumed so much of the backfield, I just think it speaks to that. And then you watch him in the preseason when he was still with the Broncos. He had a really bad drop that went for an interception at one point. And then in season so far, you watch him on some of these like flare routes, and Mahomes is getting the ball out to him because he's under pressure. It's like he's holding the ball as long as he possibly can till Perine jogs his way to the turn, and then looks back at him. And he's thrown a couple that P-Ryan has just not gotten out there for. I kind of just feel like we're not going to see it with P-Ryan's the one that I think is going to get phased out when CH comes back, because I think Steele's got the special team stuff and the like. He's a hard downhill runner, like backup fullback / in between the tackles grinder. I think a Hunt CEH Steele backfield might make sense. I kind of feel like P-Ryan's cuttable personally.
And we did cut him from some FFPC teams this week. The other kind of note there that's interesting as it relates to their willingness to incorporate the running backs into the passing game at all. I mean, this was a game where they're like, well, we're so limited at this point. McCole Hardman's going to catch 4 passes.
Right.
And he does. So I understand what you're saying about Worthy. I guess it's something where even though there's a fluky nature to it, even though the defense is saying, we don't really care if Juju catches passes. If you want to throw a bunch to him, he's going to deflect that ball at the goal line and cost you an interception and keep the game close, right? You have the missed field goal and you have that interception at the goal line that keeps this from being just an absolute bloodbath, which is something the Chiefs have done a little bit over the last several years. Not just a little bit, really quite a bit. 3 for 25, even if he's getting first reads, even if he's getting air yards. I mean, this is a game where the air yards are there, but you don't want to only rely on that for Worthy to think about him being playable and being dynamic, or if you're going to have, or if you're going to have air yards, you just need to complete some of them. You need to get more of a Brian Thomas kind of thing. I think that especially now within the context of what they're doing, Worthy might be a week or two behind where Brian Thomas is in the trajectory of these guys really becoming the focal point, and that combination of sort of dynamism and then how it builds into volume. But the other thing here, and 2 of the 3 deep targets are very clear pass interference, and yet I also want to see Worthy go up and make better plays on the ball. One of the reasons to be so excited about him the previous week is that the long touchdown that he had was not an easy play. And so, he has
but what are your thoughts on
this
Juju?
one where, well, if he's going to be the guy, and if Patrick Mahomes is going to play a little better, and if Andy Reid is going to be like, no, we're going to actually go score some points, then, my concern here would be that defenses say the same thing about Juju that they're saying about the running backs, which could end up being very good for Juju.
He had 50 air yards, I think it was, 130 receiving yards, had the 50-yard catch and run. The 50 air yards concerns me. 80 yards more in actual receiving yards. His his racer would have then been like 2.6 or something like that. And he doesn't look explosive or dynamic or any of that stuff. The fact that it was basically all yards after the catch, and he also looks like a grandpa, and he even joked about it on Twitter because somebody said he looks like your uncle or something, and he goes, "Unc can still play." He tweeted about it. He's really good at the social media stuff, but he was acknowledging it himself as well. I mean, he gets a little bit lost on that crosser, and he gets a catch and run for 50. They were throwing to him on some quick hitters, and then he was able to navigate for 10 yards or whatever, and some of those things were nice. The yak component for me is the part that he used to do that well in his prime. But you go back and look at him with KC 2 years ago. He had a 10-catch game. He had a couple 9-catch games, and they didn't have anything else over 6. He has a couple 100-yard games, couple more up in the 80-yard range, and then he has several that are 35 and lower. To me, I feel like this is a spike game, but not something. I got asked, in my Signals Gold Q&A this week, is he going to become a PPR, merchant? And I think that's what a lot of people are seeing. They're like, he's going to become the next Rashee Rice. I feel like this is a spike game. And there's a lot of yak component here that is what led to the 130 yards. And we're also going to see a 3 for 25 game from him in the next 2 weeks.
To give the full context, this is a game where it was enough that I was willing to put him in my free agent bids this week, but the bids were still $5.
Yeah,
so
that's how I wrote it up too. He was fine for a cheap ad, but I think some people wanted to go out and be aggressive, and they're seeing him as the next Rashee Rice. Juju is not the same player that he was when he was a really fantasy relevant star. He's just not, right? I mean, that's the key that I think needs to be driven home for anyone who's confused on that. If you're watching the games and have for the years, he's a different player at this point. he acknowledged it.
They just
again,
don't have
on Twitter.
They just don't have anybody else, right? I mean, they've tried
Yeah.
to make guys like Justin Watson. Obviously they drafted Sky Moore. I mean, they make the trade for Kadarius Toney. I mean, they're back to the point, and it was so weird when they signed him in the preseason. And I remember Pete asking me about him, and I was just like, are they trolling the Patriots? I don't know what the point of this was. Well, the point of it is that he can actually go out and run the route in the way that they need. And They had gotten just back to the point where they didn't have that. And they did do a little bit of preparation for a devastating injury, which was what they got. So while I agree completely that this is a spike game, but I think it is still frustrating for Worthy. And I think it's something where I would be open to being wrong on that, as opposed to saying, oh, this is definitely a one-off.
And I think I'm going even a step further. I would be open to being wrong on my read as well, but it's more so even than I'm open to being wrong. I mean, I guess I obviously just said this, but I see the Juju game as it still has to be Kelsey and Worthy that are the focal points of the passing game. And he's the guy that if he gets forgotten about, will catch the ball and run for 50 yards, and he'll be where he needs to be and all those things that you said. But the motion rates for Worthy and the ways that they were using him, and then the Kelsey element as well. Like Kelsey's going to be the other big part of the passing game. I don't know. You seem a little bit not concerned about Worthy, but a little bit. I'm pretty excited, man. The air yards I thought were bullish. He drew a big DPI. Then they go and give him a carry from the 3-yard line. He scores a touchdown. Very varied usage, short, intermediate, long. It didn't show up in the box score this week, but I watched that game and I was rooting against him. I actually got chopped in a different guillotine and I needed him to not do a lot. And we, Sean, were rooting against him, I believe, in our Dynasty League that we were playing at? One of our main events needed him to score less than maybe like 10 points and had a shot to win. And the fact that he wasn't putting numbers up was helpful for both of those teams. I was actually somewhat rooting against him for those two teams. And then he ended up scoring the rushing TD, and those two teams both lost anyway. And also the spots where we had him, we didn't get an exploded game. It was like the worst case scenario. But when I was kind of like, well, if he gets a single digit outcome in this game, it actually works well for me, and kind of rooting against him, I was pretty terrified personally. Like coming from that perspective, that every play was going to be to him, the way that they were motioning him and moving him around. I think that stuff's going to come. I'm pretty bullish on him.
Well, they showed the play where he was wide open down the field and Mahomes didn't see him. There were plenty of plays set up that were obviously to him. There's one where around the 40-yard line, he was obviously the design target on the route, and Mahomes and it was going to be a deep play, and Mahomes even, pulls his arm back and loads it like he's going to throw, not that dissimilar to the one where he did load up and hilariously just give it everything he had on a normal target to Xavier Worthy. But he ended up pulling that one down.
That was a DPI where he just chucked it as far as he could. Yeah.
He ends up pulling that one down and running for the first down, where it was the third down. And he loaded up to the point where you feel like if it's not third down, or if he has a trust in this player, he would have let it go. But with all of the running and with all of these drives for the Chiefs are just so long and so boring. And then they end up in missed field goals and interceptions at the end zone that, and obviously that's coming from the perspective of being so spoiled as both a Chiefs fan and as a fantasy player, that you're looking at these drives and you're like, I can't take it. This is so gross for a Patrick Mahomes team. But again, I think it does get back to that point where if you're going to have a lot of third downs, which teams are trying to get the Chiefs into, because that's your way to stop them. That's what you should try and do, get them into a third down. Then if you don't trust your rookie receiver to finish off the route the way you want, or you don't trust his hands, or you just know that a 50-yard pass is going to be hard to complete if you can jog for the first down yourself. And that's what you should do. You got to keep that drive alive. They have to get more intermediate to Worthy for him to be the big fantasy win. That's what people are concerned about. That's what I've been saying. You shouldn't be that concerned about. I wanted to not have that nervousness about it coming out of this game. And I think it's still reasonable to be there.
I mean, sure, but we're going into the bye. He's a rookie who's only played his first 5 pre-bye games. Usually we see the bump post-bye. 6 targets in this game, and the long target that doesn't actually count because it's the DPI plus a rush attempt, plus strong snap numbers and motion rates and all that stuff. 7 targets in a rush. Like, sometimes receivers just have down games, right? Like,
I was
good
looking at this
receivers.
because I felt
That's
like
one of
he
those
had
things.
another run that was maybe called back on penalty. Regardless of whether I'm remembering that incorrectly, he's going to be he's going to score more rushing touchdowns this season.
Yeah.
He might
Yep.
score 5 or 6.
Yeah, they like to use these types of players those ways, and he's incredibly fast, and they've already made that clear. Andy Reid's going to do all sorts of creative stuff. I'm excited for him. I think he's I hear everything you're saying, and I'm still just like, I don't know, maybe too optimistic. But where they go from here to me is still a Kelsey and Worthy passing game with Juju as an intriguing third, but like a guy that, as you described, I think we're actually very much in agreement, but just sort of coming at it from a little bit of different expectations. Yours were maybe a little higher. But like the element of like, yeah, Juju's worth an ad, but a cheap ad was like exactly the way that I was thinking about it too. So anyway, that's really intriguing. The running game stuff's really intriguing. The Chiefs are going to be really intriguing. The note that you had right at the top that they still have everyone gapped despite not having their starting running back and their best receiver. And we had concerns and their best veteran free agent receiver Hollywood Brown not playing all season. We had concerns about their skill position depth last year. That's all gone. One of my concerns last week was like they had some struggles because of the lack of skill position depth last year. And then they go into this offseason and make it a point to address a little bit. And then even though Rice looks like a guy that's going to be growing, we're still going to bring in Hollywood Brown, and we're going to go trade up and draft Xavier Worthy. And then you run into the injuries. And I worried that it would be harder for them this year because you're kind of approaching it from a perspective like we can get more one-on-one wins. We can build our offense a little differently. We're practicing. And I felt like that's what they did in the preseason because they played all these guys with Mahomes. They were like, we're not messing around. We're playing Xavier Worthy every snap in the preseason with Mahomes because we want him to start from week 1 and be a part of this offense. We need our skill position players to actually be able to do stuff. And now they don't have that. And I was like, man, this is going to be a rough year where Mahomes is going to be asked to check down a bunch and all those types of things. As good as they looked in week 5, despite those injuries, it really was a statement to how good they are in general. I mean, I was having thoughts of like, can this team go 17-0 even with a major injury to their best wide receiver? I mean, this team might be good. Like, what if they have the 17-0 season? What if they have the Brady 07 season? They are in that stage of the Patriots dynasty where they've just perfected how to win games. And they have a 17-0 season. I don't know that that's going to happen. Like I said, they've already had 4 one-score wins. They're kind of, and they tend to have those letdown games throughout a season at some point.
Well, if you look at the schedule, though, I think that there's a possibility that we'll look at least where the teams were coming in, because the Saints do have some implosion risk now, but that the Chiefs have played a pretty difficult schedule. Not a brutal one, but the close games against the Ravens and the Bengals probably not that much of a concern.
Yeah.
And the thing on defense is that, I mean, they took Kamara and Olave out of this game like it was nothing. Right? So if you don't get that shot to Rashid Shaheed, who just is doing it every week, then, I mean, you're looking at more or less a shutout in this one. Their defense is insanely good.
Yeah, they look fantastic. The big storyline this week that we got to talk about, Sean, is the ascension of Drake Maye to the starting quarterback position.
Well, Ben, let me ask you before you go there, because it kind of relates. We're going to have Spencer Rattler going in as well for Derek Carr. We've just been talking about the Saints. Olave has not done much of anything. Kamara finally looked, much more human again against the Chiefs. I mentioned some of the concerns in the peripherals. Rattler is an interesting player because he was good young, then he goes through a lot of struggles. He is not very successful in a variety of ways at South Carolina, but I was just pulling up and looking through his numbers in a sort of scheme-adjusted metric or way of filtering and looking at plays that Travis May had put together when he was at RotoViz. Still works on Travis, obviously a great college football analyst. And the numbers there, when you filter out some of the plays that really inflate the results for guys, Rattler still doesn't look very good, but his numbers are actually pretty similar to Michael Penix, who we discussed that probably was overdrafted. There's, we don't know yet. He hasn't got a chance to really show what he can do.
He looked okay in the preseason. I'm getting a little bit more intrigued by what he could be in this NFL, where I think you need these kind of drop back passers that are willing to go get vertical shots, and he does that. So anyway,
Rattler is somebody that a variety of successful, innovative NFL head coaches, which that doesn't mean that they're good at prospect evaluation, but we're not necessarily talking about the dinosaurs here. People liked Rattler despite all of that and felt like he was a fantastic leader in bad situations in college down the stretch. He is somebody that I bid very high for in shallow dynasty leagues in Superflex, where he wouldn't have been always rostered. He was still rostered in a lot of shallow leagues, but not all because they're shallow. Do you have any kind of enthusiasm or feel for him as one of this next wave? Or, we're going to see Aiden O'Connell, we're going to see Drake Maye, we're going to see Spencer Rattler. We've actually had pretty decent QB health this year within this context of a lot of the guys that we have wanted at wide receiver have gone down. So we haven't had a ton of movement at QB, but as you mentioned, that's the big storyline this week.
Yeah, the Rattler stuff, that was that was a classic Shawn question that kind of answered it. I loved your breakdown of him as you asked it. My answer would be, I don't have a lot of familiarity with his background. I did know that he was good young, as you mentioned, and then struggled, left Oklahoma for South Carolina, struggled a little bit later in his career. I remember the hype early in his collegiate career that he was considered one of the top quarterbacks in the class. And then I knew that there was some stuff from the offseason, but you were adding some great color from Travis Maye and some of the other things that there. It seems like he has a little bit of upside, right? Like that there's some potential for a guy who went a little later in the draft to be one of these kinds of gems that goes a little bit later in the draft. And I guess from my recollection, just this isn't about Rattler, but this is about the way that these things go. It reminds me a little bit of some of the ones that have actually worked in the later rounds. I guess I'm going all the way back to when Kirk Cousins was young, but I remember when Kirk Cousins got drafted, people justified taking him behind Griffin because they thought he was a very worthwhile 4th round pick. And some of those guys do tend to actually already have shown that they were a guy worth going after, I guess. Rattler being a 5th rounder this year, obviously the expectations are low and he could just be very, very bad, but maybe there's some optimism or some potential for him to be a little bit decent. My concern is more broadly that the Saints offense just hasn't looked good for a few weeks. They were very run heavy again. So it looked really great early. They're using a lot of motion, a lot of misdirection. But one of the things I talked about in signals was that Kubiak, who was getting a ton of positive flowers for all of the motion and all that stuff that he was doing, was also calling some really run heavy games, even relative to expectation. But because they were getting out ahead of some of these games, like the Cowboy game was a blowout, but they just stopped throwing, but they were able to just keep running effectively.
Does it seem like a good note on the telecast where they're like, Clint Kubiak has taken a lot of responsibilities away from Derek Carr, let him just play? You're like, for a mid-30s quarterback, is that the...
that doesn't seem great. So their pass rate over expected, they were the only team, one of only 2 teams in football through 3 weeks that were at least negative 9% or lower in all 3 games. That's relative to expected. So even those games where they were leading, they were very run heavy relative to low expected run rates, right? So just low expected pass rates, extremely run heavy in those games. And then they played the Falcons, who were the other team. Falcons finally opened it up in week 4, opened it up again in week 5, a little bit more pass heavy. They have a reason for it. They had a quarterback coming back from an Achilles. Saints were very run heavy again in week 4, still reasonably run heavy in this game relative to expectation and where they're trailing. And I think that was part of what that we saw with the Chiefs as well. One of the things you were talking about through there is how good the defense was. The Chiefs offense needs to be pushed a little bit. And I feel like they were just we know the Saints aren't going to push us. They're going to run the ball way too much. We've talked about in the past where teams that beat the Chiefs, let the Chiefs run, but then they got to be aggressive on offense. Like when the Packers did that to them last year, and then the Packers were very efficient on offense. The Saints were not fulfilling that side of that on offense. They were out there running the ball and trying to establish it. And they did finally score when they went deep to Shaheed, right? When they got a little bit aggressive, but a lot of the other stuff, some of it was, probably the defense taking it away. You talked about with Olave and stuff, but I thought the Chiefs played this game so well in part because they were daring the Saints to be more aggressive, and the Saints offense isn't aggressive enough. And now that you go to a rookie quarterback, that's where I get really concerned. You were talking about that note that they're taking some of the responsibilities away from Carr. Well, how much of a micromanager is he going to be on a rookie quarterback? How extremely run heavy is this rate going to get? Is it going to be a negative 15%, pass rate over expected, which means even if they are able to win, because their defense can play a little bit, it's not a fun win. It's for fantasy, right? It's going to be a kind of a slow game. That's where I'm at with the Rattler stuff is I have a lot of pessimism right now about the offense, actually. I think Kubiak's done things well, but I've called him like a half sharp. We have the fake sharp, we have the real sharp, these ideas. To me, he's done a lot of there's the like sort of game management aspect, and then there's the scheme and play design stuff. He's done a lot of the scheme and play design stuff well, effectively. Although I've also seen notes that they're not motioning or doing a lot of that stuff at the same rate. The play action stuff has come down since those first couple games. It's sort of abandoned it a little, which is not great. But that's the side that he's been better at overall through 5 weeks. The game management side, to me, you're running on when I dug into it, the running backs don't matter. RBSDM.com website that Ben Baldwin curates. When I looked at their pass rate over expected in different situations, they're running extremely heavy relative to expectation in some of these spots where you're like, you'd love to see them pass a little bit more. It's basically every third down, even if it's third and long. And it's like the second and mediums where it's like if they get to second and sevens, you were talking about with the Chiefs, they're running like 25% heavier than league average on 2nd and 3 to 7. They're never throwing in second and medium. They're just always running to try to set up a third and short, that's not a modern offense. That's not the stuff that we want to see. Actually, we want to see some variance, some throwing on non-obvious downs. Even if you're ahead of the chains, okay, now, but go back and throw the ball in that spot. I think he's a little bit of a half sharp because I think that side of it is very old school in the way that he calls the game and the run pass stuff. And so anyway, as far as whether Rattlers, and then that gets to the Maye thing that you brought up as well, which is that, like, what are we going to get from their offense? And one of the things I was saying to you before the game is I've been a little bit critical of Kingsbury. I think he's doing a better job here than he was doing in Arizona. I was critical in the first couple weeks because they weren't doing any deep throws at all. His Jane Daniels ADOT was so low. And I had people saying they were kind of bringing him along slowly, but it's not hard for a quarterback to throw deep. There's ways that you can do it. I was talking to you about it before, so I'm not going to go into a whole thing, but you can basically design deep shots. If you need to get the ball out quick, you can still call it as being out quick. And just say if the safety's there, just throw it away. I would call it on a 1st and 10 in a non-obvious spot where you're more likely to get, a single high safety. You're more likely to get one-on-one on the outside and basically be like, this is a one read play. You're going to put it up. If the safety rolls over there and it's not there, overthrow it, throw it out of bounds, whatever. Show that we're willing to push the ball down the field. That is one of the elements that opens things up. At any rate, Kingsbury didn't do a lot of that in weeks 1 and 2. He started doing it in week 3. Daniels went off. Part of the reason I was talking to you about that is then people were like, well, look, Kingsbury's plan worked. And my thing was like, no, week 3 says that they should have been doing more of that in weeks 1 and 2. And Jane Daniels is a superstar. And they weren't as good offensively in weeks 1 and 2 as they could have been. They've continued to be willing to throw downfield in weeks 4 and 5. They look fantastic, in part because Jane Daniels is so dynamic. I'm criticizing Kingsbury while also trying to say that I kind of like what they've done with the short passing and getting the ball out of his hands and letting him get the ball out of his hands quickly. We've talked about Daniels a lot. We've talked about how he's added to that. He still had a high completion percentage over expectation, despite a really low time to throw, something that not a lot of quarterbacks have. It is a special combination in the data of what he's able to do. But that's what we would love to see with Drake Maye, honestly. And so it's I'm saying that the way that Kingsbury's doing it for Daniels, certainly a lot better than what we're seeing with Shane Waldron for Caleb Williams. Drake Maye's taking over an offense that doesn't have a good offensive line, right? He could be immediately as good as we've talked about him since the offseason as a guy who, going into last collegiate season was right there with Caleb Williams as the 1-2, right? Daniels earned his way up into that conversation with a great 2023 season in college. But Drake Maye was a 3-year early declare that was always looked at as a top 5 pick, basically. You've talked through this as a prospect, very high ceiling for this type of prospect, a young guy coming out that was always viewed this favorably. has the high ADOT potential, right? Can take the shots downfield, has the mobility, but there's a lot of concern about the protection and all of those things and how he'll look right out of the gate. I thought he looked really poised in the preseason. The play calling stuff, I think, is really relevant for him too. I just threw a lot at you, but I think the play calling stuff is going to be really relevant for Rattler, and I think it might let him down a little bit or just be too run heavy for that offense to be fun. Alex Van Pelt is a big question mark for Drake Maye as well. Those are the ways that I'm thinking through those two. Is I don't know if it's going to be more like Waldron and Caleb. I would like it to be more like what Kingsbury's been able to do to at least allow Daniels to have the room to be clear. I still think it's way more Daniels that is the reason that they've been so successful.
With Rattler, the Olave results this year have been so catastrophic that I think there's a chance that this is just the final nail and now it's done. And Olave is not even playable. I mean, you're talking about a second round pick, a second, third turn, depending on the format, and a guy that I thought was going to outperform that, who now you can't even put into your lineup. But there's also that possibility that Rattler unlocks him. And if you're just not getting the targets you need to a guy, sometimes even if the backup quarterback is worse, just a little bit different perspective on the field within the context of whatever the offense is at that point can be nice. That might be a positive. I think that, I've been a Derek Carr fan. I think he was doing some good things this year. I think there's a non-zero chance that he doesn't ever start for the Saints again. And I think the Saints, if it's close, would actually like that, because then you end up with the situation where you have that young, free-ish player, basically free, who could then be the foundation for some things going forward. Maye is fun because probably not quite to the extent of a fifth-round pick, but the range of outcomes for him is astronomically wide. And that part just makes watching them now over the next couple of weeks really interesting. You talked about the offensive line. The SIS numbers have the Patriots, whether you look at blown blocks on passing plays or just the pass blocking points earned per snap, which is going to maybe give you a little bit more of a nuanced view than just looking at it from a blown block perspective. But they're basically fourth worst in both of those. The teams that are similarly bad are teams like the Rams and Titans and Seahawks. And we certainly saw how that hurt Geno Smith and the Seahawks this last week, as you had a lot of sacks. When Maye had a chance to play a little bit earlier this season, the combination of the terrible offensive line and his competitiveness put him in a situation where you're like, if this is a full game, you're talking about the potential for 10 or 15 sacks. And so the first thing I think you look at here is just, if you're streaming defenses, then whoever is playing the Patriots has to be very high on your list, because I do think that they will try and do some things. I do think they will try and compete. I don't think it's just going to simply be hand off to Stevenson, hand off to Antonio Gibson. You had the weirdness last week where you have kind of the fake benching of Stevenson, which I did unfortunately swap him in our dynasty lineup, and that cost us the win. You have some solid running back play there, and yet now we have Drake Maye, who, especially in 2022, you look at 2022 and 2023 together, a lot of very encouraging peripherals for him, not to the level of a Caleb Williams, not to the level of a final season Jaden Daniels, but this is a guy who has size, he has mobility, he's got arm strength. I think that Maye gives you what people want a Will Levis to have with the arm strength, what they want an Anthony Richardson to have with the arm strength and the willingness to attack deep. And to be sure, we've gotten some big plays with Anthony Richardson and the Colts. But Maye brings that with better accuracy, better upside. Now, one of the things that does show up in the numbers is that he was willing to throw deep last season at a very high rate, but the accuracy on those passes was poor. So you do want to balance some of those things. 2022, more encouraging from that perspective, I believe. But if we get any complementary player step up. If this is the kind of time period where Jalen Polk is going to do something, if you have a Kendrick Bourne available, if you have a Demario Douglas giving you the underneath stuff, if they can get complementary routes and complementary production from the receivers where he actually has some guys available, I mean, that would be the other thing I think within this overall offensive picture where that they have a bad offensive line and that they have questions at coordinator. And so there's going to be that tendency to be conservative. But what is he going to get from his receivers? If he does get some production, if some guys are getting open, then I think we could have something. But when you have questions about the QB, questions about the blocking, questions about the coordinator, and then questions of whether or not any of the receivers can step up, we could get anything from far sub Jacoby Brissett type of play for a while as you put a young player in such a bad context to suddenly looking like a savior almost right away.
Yeah, the Patriots have averaged, I think it's like 115 pass yards per game. It's just a truly atrocious number. So, I mean, it's not a high bar right now to look like a savior. Yeah, I a lot of the conversation this week has been around the way that the Patriots handled it and whether it was the right time. And I think a lot of it is just, if you're going to say that you're going to protect him and the team's not ready and all that stuff, then waiting until, I believe it's David Andrews has the significant injury and he's their long-term, center. And the offensive line has just gotten worse and the situation's gotten worse, and then throw him out there when the situation's worse. That just doesn't track. And so a lot of people have kind of called that for the hypocrisy that it appears to be. But despite that, there might just be a big enough gap, and there might just be the ability for Drake Maye to be so dynamic, which is, again, to get back to the Jaden Daniels comp, like, I think Kingsbury's getting in some corners of the NFL space too much credit. And that was sort of part of the point I was trying to make, where it's like, yeah, you can say that they're doing great, but like part of that is just that Jaden Daniels is probably, he's the MVP right now. Like I don't know how bullish you want to go with the statement, but he's a top 5 quarterback in the NFL, at least. I mean, like, he's that good right now. He might be the best player in the league at the current moment. I mean, that's obviously a bullish take as it relates to Patrick Mahomes, but Jane Daniels is playing incredible football. He has turned the Commanders around sort of single-handedly. At any rate, you don't expect that for Drake Maye. You can't grade him on that scale or any of those things. It's part of why I think people are a little bit misunderstanding Caleb Williams right now as well, who it's been an undeniably good start for him, especially relative to the situation and the Shane Waldron offense and all those things. He's been fine. He's been able to elevate. He's been able to overcome. And I hope we see that from Maye. We see the talent, but there are also the outs to him even looking somewhere between, I guess, Caleb and Daniels, looking better than Caleb right away, looking so much better than Brissett. But yeah, this is a team that has, right down there with Miami for the fewest points scored, but Miami has a lot more yards. I believe it's the fewest. It's definitely the fewest pass yards per game. The Patriots, they've ran the ball effectively enough that they're not dead last in overall yardage or anything like that. There are 2 teams that have fewer pass yards than them, but they both had buys last week, the Titans and Chargers, and they're right behind the Patriots. So if you look at it per game is what I'm getting at. There's no one who's played 5 games that's even within 100 pass yards of them. They have 597 pass yards through 5 games. They don't even have 600 pass yards through 5 games. It's just really, really low. Can Drake Maye, and they have 2 pass TDs. They're the only team that only has 2 pass TDs. Can Drake Maye Miami also only has 2, but can Drake Maye immediately improve that stuff? Like, it's almost feels like the default. Like those, it's been really, really bad. I don't know. I'm excited to see the way that goes. I think Jalen Polk is an intriguing stash right now. His snap share, his route share has risen the last 2 weeks. First 3 weeks, it was never over. I want to say his highest was in the high 60s. 85% in week 4, 95% in week 5 in terms of routes per drop back. And so he's becoming sort of more of a full-time player right at a time where Drake Maye's taking over. You got that little bit of a rookie connection. You got the potential for him I think to be the biggest beneficiary if Drake Maye does do some exceptional stuff, like you were sort of alluding to. You mentioned O'Connell in this. Are you
Then
optimistic about him at all?
before you go there really quickly, let me say that when we think about the the extreme ceiling outcome, the one that will be really exciting. Drake Maye, I mentioned 2022 better. I mentioned Travis May's scheme adjusted numbers. So this isn't exactly the way he does it, but jet motion, play action removed, 6+ air yards. So you're having a certain type of play that might more closely replicate an NFL type of play. And again, those other elements are removed simply because they do inflate the numbers and because QBs get different numbers of them within their own college schemes that can really create apples and oranges. 2022, the numbers in that category for Maye, his IQR, which is the passer rating that SIS has with a scouting component or a charting component on top, where you're removing things like drops, you're penalizing quarterbacks for throwing interceptable balls, even if those interceptions were dropped, all of that kind of thing. Basically in line with, but very slightly better than CJ Stroud and Caleb Williams. Right. So again, it doesn't mean that he'll be those guys. There are plenty of reasons to believe that he's not quite that level of player, but he has had a college season when he was very young where he was just extremely successful. And on the types of throws that NFL quarterbacks are going to need to make, I think he's going to take a ton of sacks with that offensive line, and you're going to have a bunch of broken drives. You're going to have a bunch of turnovers. But the highlights are coming, and this is the reason that people, even when they knew he wasn't going to play at the beginning, were drafting him in best ball. I think you're going to see some big plays. You're going to see this New England Patriots offense get exciting from the perspective of not necessarily good, but exciting. And so,
yeah,
this is fun. This is what we want. If you didn't think he could play at this point, you shouldn't have drafted him. They had they had huge offers for him. If you don't think a guy is ready to play as a rookie, then you don't believe that he's good enough to turn down the massive packages that you were offered to trade out of that spot. So now we get to see what he can do.
Yeah, that should be a blast. Yeah, you mentioned Aiden O'Connell. I was kind of just skipping past him because the Raiders kind of suck. He wasn't very good. He was okay at times last year. He wasn't very good in little stints this year. It's kind of interesting that he played in relief of Gardner Minshew this past week. He threw for fewer yards on more attempts, fewer completions on more attempts.
It's a little bit of a bummer for Brock Bowers, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like you'd rather just Minshew. I think you got to give O'Connell an opportunity to game plan as a starter and go out there and play and whatever, but it's not like we're expecting a big improvement necessarily. Miami's a team we've been talking about. They are going on a bye. You mentioned that, it's not great right now with 2 out. They did get a win. They go to 2-3. I'm like a little bit optimistic that we might actually get that offense being fun a little bit later in the season. I'm not out entirely on Miami. They look awful, but I mean, if people are, suggesting that Mike McDaniel's he's been figured out or whatever. And we'll see.
Know?
Yeah. How would we know? It's been a weird year. That's one that I just wanted to highlight as well, that I'm still looking at, that there could be some optimism there. And the fact that they're 2-3 going into this bye and have an opportunity to maybe come out of the bye and actually think that they're a contender is sort of helpful.
They rushed for 193 rushing yards in a game where the opponent knew they couldn't pass. So it seems like your run schemes actually still work fine.
It still works fine. Yeah, exactly. Another team I wanted to circle back to that I think we sort of touched on, or I mentioned when we're talking about the Saints, was the Falcons. The 3 games with the -9% PROE or lower, I have comped for a while now, since it was sort of happening at the beginning, to, I believe it's 2021 with the Bengals, with Joe Burrow coming off his ACL, where they were very run heavy for the first month, and then starting in week 5 going forward, it was just a consistently different team. And they actually played 3 postseason games or 4 postseason games that year. It's the year they went to the Super Bowl. And so there was 17 games after that. And so the whole next offseason, I was like, if we just start from week 5, when they started being a normal offense, and then go through their postseason games, we can look at, it was Jamar Chase's rookie year. It was we can look at Jamar Chase's week, 17 game rookie year, including the playoffs. And and just control for those first 4 games where they're extremely run heavy. My point in bringing that up is that once we shifted and the Bengals were clearly trying to kind of protect Burrow a little bit for the first month because he was coming off that ACL. He hadn't played at all in the preseason. Once they shifted, they were a different offense the rest of the way. They didn't have the potential to go super run heavy again. 2 of their biggest negative PROE games of the year were in the first 3 games that year. Their other one was like close to their lowest for the rest of the season, right? Again, so the point being, if I'm right in the hypothesis with the Falcons, it's that the data right now that we're seeing for all the Falcons players is a 5-game sample that includes 3 games that are extremely run heavy, that are not going to be predictive of really anything in their range of outcomes going forward. I don't think we'll even see a game the rest of the year that's that run heavy. It may happen once or twice, but we're talking 10 percentage points to the run. It's a pretty rare outcome. And they've been meaningfully pass heavy the 2 games since and shown some life. And they win this big game on Thursday night of last week. That's a team that I think going forward is going to be misunderstood by people who are just looking at the 5-week data sample, because you really weeks 4 and 5. Now, week 5 is not a great sample in and of itself either. We have 500 pass yards. We have 4 touchdowns. We have the whole thing. Way too much pass volume. One of the things I wrote about in Signals with Kyle Pitts, he has a good game and it looks good and it's exciting, but they talked about wanting to use him more, and they did throw to him with intent early. But then when this game went crazy, none of the targets were really actually going to him. He was still 4th on the team in this one. Mooney has 16 targets. London has something like 13. And even Ray McLeod had 9. And then Pitts has 8. So it's his first game with 8 targets since like week 12 of last year or something for Pitts. But it also comes in a game where all the other receivers out-target him because they throw 58 times or whatever it was. So that's a game with crazy stats that reminds us why we use market share numbers. But still, I wanted to emphasize that weeks 4 and 5, a little bit more indicative, if we control for the craziness in week 5, of what I expect for the Falcons going forward than what we saw in the first 3 weeks. Very, very run heavy.
No, I think that you put that perfectly. It was encouraging that he was used early, because at that point you don't know that you're going to have almost 60 passing attempts. It's discouraging that as you just get in the flow of calling plays and running your offense, you're like, you know who's getting open is Darnell Mooney.
Yeah. We're going to throw Darnell Mooney every time. I think Pitts in a game where he got the 8 targets ended with, it was like a 13% target share. I don't know. I guess I could do the math real quick, but it wasn't enough. It's like, this is supposed to be his breakout game, and it was not a high target share.
Any concerns about Bijan Robinson?
A little bit. I mean, I got asked about him a ton. I wrote that up as if, like, obviously it's concerning, but also there's a lot of people that are saying that like it's definitely over for him. And I think that's not the case based on some of the offensive stuff that I just said. It's concerning that they had such a big offensive game and he only had like 10 PPR points. You want him to obviously be a part of that type of a bonanza. He should be a bigger focal point of the offense. At the same time, Kirk Cousins being able to stand in there and throw the ball down the field is only going to make it a little bit easier for them to run. His like missed tackles force and some of that stuff have been good. Algiers actually looked a little bit better at times, right? But both of the runners have had some trouble with the fact that nobody actually respects Kirk Cousins being able to stand back there and push off on that Achilles and throw the ball since week 1 when they had the comical game plan. And Atlanta's now finally starting to show that just in these last 2 weeks that actually has to be respected now. And then you see the downstream effects coming forward. I would expect from week 6 on the impact of the passing game on the run game to be better than it has at any of the first 5 weeks. Like what I'm saying is that the first three games I'm pulling out from a team level, like pass volume perspective, but I'd also kind of pull out 4 and 5 in terms of defensive game plan. They had to show that they could throw effectively, right? Like that's part of why they threw for 500 yards, I think, is probably a game plan that was more concerned about stopping some of the run and not really giving enough credit to Cousins' ability to stand back there and rip some of those throws. But now he's put that on tape. He's shown that. Then you see the downstream effects. It's got to be a little bit better for him and for Algier going forward that the passing game has shown competence. There's still concerns, right? Like the fact that they're not thrown to the backs a lot. Cousins is getting the ball downfield to McLeod and stuff, and that's hurting the running back target rate a little bit. But
because he ran a lot of routes in this game.
Yeah. I think he's going to have his 20-point games, though. And I think he's going to have multiple of them. And I think people think that he's not. And that's where I would say he's not, even if we were concerned a little bit about the efficiency, which I think some people watching the game are saying it doesn't look as good. It's not the same thing as Kyren, but because Kyren's getting the 85% snap share and Bijan's not really because of the Algier stuff. So, okay, maybe he can't add the hyper efficiency stuff that we were hoping for in his biggest ceiling situation. It's still a good offense for scoring. And I still think that like Kyren is a guy who exemplifies that, as if, he doesn't necessarily add a ton of explosiveness and hyper efficiency and that stuff. So like, if he contextually can succeed with the Rams, it's not the same offense, and Bijan doesn't have the same workload, but I'm just trying to use an example of a guy who is a really good fantasy scorer, and the things that people are worried about with Bijan, you'd be worried about with Kyren too, in terms of like, he kind of needs the offense to help elevate him a little bit. It's not like Bijan's just going to be terrible. And I do think he's actually still more talented than Kyren. So anyway, it's kind of a weird comp, but are you concerned about him in terms like?
Once I went through all of the stats and let the frustration of the actual scoring die down a little bit, I did find plenty of elements that I thought were like very mildly positive for both Bijan Robinson and Breece Hall. We mentioned Todd Downing in the intro. The 2021 season for him didn't look very good, at least in small part because Henry got hurt. And then you're trying to run this really run heavy offense with backs who are not Derrick Henry. 2022, Henry goes for almost 2,000 yards from scrimmage. They just really need to lean back into Breece Hall. I'm desperately hoping that a tiny little bit of what could happen here is that Saleh was just not as big a fan as Breece Hall as maybe he should be. Now, when we think about changes teams are going through, when we think about that Arthur Smith element, one of the things with Derrick Henry and with Arthur Smith and that move to Ryan Tannehill and how in 2019, when he led the NFL in all of these efficiency stats, adjusted yards per attempt, yards per completion, quarterback rating, adjusted net yards per attempt, they were still good in 2020. And then 2021 and 2022, those numbers somewhat collapse. So we're certainly not getting something here that is going to completely rescue Breece Hall, just like I don't think that the situation with Atlanta fixes the small problems that have cropped up, or just that the offense is going to be better. But I think there's room to relax and see what they do. It's probably not going to be a situation where we get the double-digit, the double-double, right? The EP double-double that we love, where you're averaging 10 rushing expected points, 10 receiving expected points. Maybe you average 3 to 5 fantasy points over expected. You talked about getting the 20-point games. I mean, we certainly had reason to believe that if things fell a certain way, they might like average 23 points per game.
Right.
That's certainly out the window. But
I mean, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but when you start talking about the Jets too, I mean, the first 5 games is just another example of where like you had a quarterback with an Achilles coming back. First couple games, they weren't really pressing. And then the 4th game, they play in a freaking rainstorm. And then the 5th game, they play in London. And like, in terms of like being intellectually honest with projecting it forward, I'm not just trying to be an apologist for Breece Hall, but you could understand why the first 5 games might not be super representative of the rest of the season when you look back on it. And when I pull back those seasons like that 2021 Bengals season, I'm not just trying, that's just the first one that comes to mind, but there's a lot of those types of years where we look back on it and we go, man, yeah, the first month was kind of wonky for them and they settled in. Neither of these teams is really in mid-season form yet, right? I mean, because of their quarterbacks coming off Achilles and those types of things. And then one team just fired their offensive coordinator or their head coach, and now they should have fired their offensive coordinator, fired their head coach, replaced their offensive coordinator. You're getting all sorts of, sort of tacit admissions that like, yeah, this isn't going the way we expected either so far. We got to get it figured out. We got to get the things that we want to work. That doesn't mean that they're going to necessarily just happen, because it's not easy to figure these things out. But
I talked about the EP per snap or the points earned per snap from a pass blocking perspective with the Patriots. On a run blocking perspective, the Jets rank dead last. I mean, that shows you that there are some problems with the offensive line that are very real. And yet, if they could move not even necessarily into the middle, but out of dead last, out of that range where you're absolutely killing your running back play, that would help Breece Hall as well.
Right. So there's a lot of ways that there's room for improvement. That's also, like you said, it could also just be looked at as like pretty scary that they're absolutely dead last. But I mean, another team to bring up, I guess, in this regard is the Broncos, who we finally saw a decent little running back game out of. Like, I mean, Javonte gets tackled at the 1 again and then gets immediately taken out, and Jaleel gets the touchdown. But he has 5 catches, 50 yards. He runs for whatever it was, 60 yards or something. We see that like high value touch roll where it's like, hey, if you can give us 100 total yards with 5 catches, it's 15 PPR points right there without a touchdown, which is what we got in this game. Their first 4 games also, I mean, 2 really tough matchups to start: on the road at Seattle, at home against the Steelers. Those have looked like pretty good defenses, not necessarily Seattle throughout, but I do think about what Mike McDonald's going to do in his first game as a head coach at home. He probably had some things to throw off a rookie quarterback that, maybe Brian Dable and the Giants did a better job against the Seahawks defense last week, or the Lions did a better job the week prior. But you can understand why that was a little bit of a tricky first assignment for Bo Nix. And then they come back home and they have the Steelers in week 2. They do well in Tampa. And then in week 4, they're in that rain game against the Jets. And they finally get this game in week 5 against the Raiders. That's actually a good matchup. But you see that like the running backs can produce in a certain setting. It's one of those things where like, yeah, we are a third of the way or a quarter of the way through the season. But some of these teams have had not just tough matchups, but unique circumstances where we get really frustrated when we get 4 or 5 bad outcomes in a row. But a couple of, like, how many of them are actually bad outcomes? How many of them are kind of throw away the whole game because it's such a weird circumstance from the whole team? This is not what the team's going to look like necessarily. The Broncos are another example of one for me where it's like, you don't throw away all of it, but it is like a noisy element. And it's the same thing. A rookie quarterback it's the same thing as the Achilles comments I was making, where it's like the rookie quarterback in the first couple of games is not going to be representative of what he becomes once he starts to actually figure some things out. I'm not saying Bo Nix is going to be a superstar. You were making some comments to me, I believe, before the show that it seems like the defenses are not really respecting him as a passer right now as well, which is maybe going to be an ongoing issue. But there's at least room for things to change in certain settings and in certain. There's still a lot of time left, man. This first month, the biggest thing that I've taken from it is that the lack of practicing with pads in the offseason, the shorter preseason, all that kind of stuff. I don't even necessarily say that that's wrong, but I think we have to keep it in mind that if they're going to play a 17, because they are playing 17-game seasons, and I don't think we want a bunch of guys getting hurt in August. I'm kind of okay with the fact that week 1 is an extension of the preseason and like whatever. At least if somebody gets hurt, it's in a game that matters. But the lack of offseason stuff does make the first few weeks a little bit of an extension of the preseason is sort of the take. And so of anything that's going to be indicative of what actually matters when we get to fantasy playoff time and just really for the rest of this chunk of the middle of the season until we get there, these first 5 games are probably in some cases the least representative. We've learned stuff about some of the rookies and in some of those things that I think is really, really useful and is very important. Brock Bowers and Malik Neighbors and Jaden Daniels, those guys have succeeded and that's going to just get better. But the stuff that, is these offenses that are really not finding their footing in those things. I mean, you have to predict a really historically bad season all the way through that they're not going to find answers. Those teams are looking for answers. They're looking for different things now. It'll be interesting to see how they evolve.
I think it's a really fun way to look at it. The thing that you're trying to do as an analyst for your subscribers and for yourself is to try and not fall into big traps where you're just obviously thinking about things completely incorrectly. If you can be just moderately okay with how you're thinking about this stuff, then you're going to come out really in pretty good shape because it's so difficult not to fall into the traps. And so, what do those traps look like? one of the traps is just ignoring all of the information. And because you have these elements that you just discussed, feeling like almost none of it is representative, one of the traps is that once we get out of the range where the stats become less predictive for what's going to happen this next week, to kind of eliminate them entirely from our thinking. Because we know when you're doing things like building the game level similarity projections, obviously there's this entire universe of fantastic projections out there that people are doing for betting and for DFS and for starting lineups and all of those types of things. You're talking about usually the most recent 6 to 8 weeks as being the sample that helps you, in part because of what you're just saying. These things that we're having happen in the first 5 weeks, once we get into the fantasy playoffs, they may not be very relevant at all anymore. And yet we don't want to forget all of the information that we know from previous weeks and previous seasons about the overall quality of a player.
Yeah.
We don't want to go in and look at the first 5 weeks here and say, this is going to be definitive. If you can remain dynamic with your thinking, where you are aware of the areas that the stats are not going to help you or could actively mislead you without throwing out everything, while also trying to keep the portion of your priors that is going to be important for not making similar mistakes in a 1 week scenario going forward. That's one of the things that makes fantasy football so fun, I think. It's frustrating to some people because we can't play it as methodically or as robotically as you can play some other sports where you have such large samples that people play every day. You can work through that. I think it's the genius of fantasy football. And one of the things that makes it so much fun is that you have to be creative in your thinking, dynamic in your thinking, without feeling like you're some kind of genius that can just ignore everything and go entirely your own way. That mix of both incentives, but then the mix of attributes that you have to have to remain engaged in the right way as you're going through each week, I just think it's a lot of fun. And those were kind of the thoughts I was having as you were working through some of these elements that might not be predictive. It's so cool. One of the things that pops up for me here using our streamer, Denver has the 4th best remaining QB strength of schedule. I wouldn't use that to say, oh, Bo Nix is going to be some great pickup and is going to score a lot of points for you himself. I do think it's positive for the other players on the team in that they could be positioned to not have so many plays where the offensive line is just overwhelmed. And Sean Payton's like, well, we can't call a deep ball. You don't have time. We can't call a running play because those guys are going to encounter defenders in the backfield. We can't run our offense. I think with the Broncos, you're going to see them start running their offense. And one of the cool things that happened this last week is you got to see the fire that Bo Nix has. I think that's going to be positive for him. I think it's going to be positive for his teammates. The Denver Broncos are going to make the playoffs. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to filter down to the fantasy players, but I mean, they're another team with a good defense.
You said there was a bunch of things that came to your mind as I was saying all those things. And as you said all that, there was so much coming to my mind that I just had to type a few down. But when I was talking about all these teams that the first 5 weeks aren't going to be predictive of them, you were also talking about how we also have to be somewhat cognizant of the things that are basically, you were talking through like what's signal and what's noise, like to frame it how I like to do it over at Stealing Signals. Obviously, we're trying to figure out what things actually are relevant and what things aren't. But my first thought was like, absolutely. There's a lot of the teams that we've seen through the first 5 weeks that it actually feels like that it is really representative. I guess I was kind of making it sound like it's all nonsense, but it's not. I mean, a lot of it isn't. I'm just looking through like the different teams. I mean, like I mentioned Jane Daniels, Washington. Some of the teams that are playing well, we're seeing the ways that they want to play. The Vikings are playing really well. They're going on a bye right now. The Steelers are 3-2. We've seen the pass volume stuff to go away from like the really exciting offenses to maybe the less exciting offenses. There are several teams like that you're like, yeah, I mean, what they've done so far is probably pretty indicative of what they're going to be going forward, right? And so there is interesting, and there's other teams like maybe like the Colts who have played with 2 different quarterbacks, and you see like a range of things. And certainly there are things that are relevant to the future. You talked about dynamic thinking, and really what it comes down to is not just being tied to past data, but being willing to still use past data to be helpful. Now, this is a tricky thing because one of the notes I just made was this idea of domain knowledge. Our buddy and longtime RotoViz guy, but has gone on to do so much other awesome stuff. Kevin Cole was tweeting recently about how experts in a lot of fields overvalue their expertise, basically overvalue their domain knowledge and their relative to some of the models and some of the, especially the base rates and what our base rate expectations should be. And he is applying that to football. And I think it's very interesting and applied to football. I also think that football is such a small sample and such a multivariable thing and so dynamic that I'm basically sitting here saying that I think that despite the fact that the broad trends across all domains has shown that experts overvalue their expertise and their domain knowledge, and that's been proven time and time again in medical and everything else, that I also think that we should overvalue our domain knowledge in football to a certain degree because we don't actually have very reliable stats and those types of things. Now, obviously, that is a point that I'm making that is immediately refutable by saying, well, that's what all the other experts say or believe. I still think it's interesting to consider that maybe it actually, like, the Arrested Development meme. How did that go for all the other people? Well, it went horribly, but it might go well for us. I'm actually suggesting that I think that that's a real bit of analysis in this case, which is absurd to think, but also it's not so absurd if you think about it for a second, that there could actually be some domains that wouldn't be reflective of the larger trend across all, where there, because you can actually model stuff in medical and some of these other places a little bit better than we have such small samples in sports. And there are so many different variables. Anyway, the idea for me, though, to wrap all of that up, as you were saying it, in terms of dynamic thinking and all of those things, and trying to be aware of the fact that we can easily overstate our own domain knowledge. I'm not saying we should ignore that point. That's why I brought it up. It should be something to be aware of. But the whole thing is, you said the word dynamic thinking and all that. What we're really doing is predicting forward, right? Like, one of the things that I came across this week was like trying to explain how Mark Andrews has failed. And it was like, what in the past data could show us that? And there was nothing like super glaring in the past data that would show this level of lack of performance. And if you're trying to figure it out in hindsight by trying to look back at the past data to figure it out, you're probably not going to. It's not there, right? Like, so like what you need to be doing at any given time is not trying to cut the data into so many different forms that you can find the thing that is actually the thing that tells you it, because some of it really is just noise. And that was sort of the point that I was making about what the Jets have done so far in their 5 games or what the Broncos have done. And you're saying, and that's the point I was making with the Falcons, especially with their 3 -9% PROE games, that those games are not going to be reflective of even part of the range of outcomes going forward. That's why I said it that way. That is data that is not completely thrown out. And we can look at the individual player level and a lot of different things from those games, but it is data that to me is just going to be more misleading. Now, again, I'm doing the domain knowledge thing right now, but that is how I'm reading it relative to the Bengals stuff and some of the other examples that I gave, the Bengals in 2021. Broadly, all of that is in service of trying to predict the future. That's what we're always doing. So what all of this comes back to for me, in the way that you said it, was we're trying to predict week 6 and beyond. And when we talk about this stuff, we're not trying to be biased. We're not trying to throw out data that we don't like. We're not trying to just tell you that the good things are good or the bad things are bad, or the things that we said were going to be good are good and the things that we said are going to be bad or any of that. We're trying to find essentially truth in our predictions and what's actually accurate by trying to sift through both the data that is available and matters, and stuff that we are sort of surmising or contextualizing based on what we've seen, but we believe to not necessarily be true. Like with again, these teams that I was talking about, there being a lot of noise in those things. And so it all comes back to, as we talk through the stuff and we think through it, we should have a focus on forward. And I just think there's you mentioned it early in the show. We talked about it a little bit before the show about like some of the ways that the data is being used in those things right now. People want things to be 100% represented in data, and we just know that can't happen in football. All of our history is like that's not, even as our data gets better, it's not possible. That was a big conversation we had a few weeks ago about Tyler Beatty, whatever you want to call him, vis-a-vis like the other Broncos. Is like this really small sample that shows that he's the only good runner on this team, and it's like it's one long run. We talked about it a little bit with Bigsby. He's had some long runs. I was gonna say that he immediately looks like this really dynamic player on a per touch basis. A lot of that came from the Colts game in particular. He had this massive rate of missed tackles force that was bigger than the rest of the games combined. But anyway, it's just, you're going to see data used in small samples to predict stuff. And there are a lot of people that believe that it has to be there in the past data, as opposed to like, how do we regress this? I guess this actually gets back to Kevin Cole's point. How do we regress this to a base rate, right? Like, is Tank Bigsby going to have a 50-yard run every single week? Like, probably not, right? So how do we predict forward is what we're always trying to do. Some of it's going to be signal, some of it's going to be noise, but we have to keep that forward thinking mindset. It's not always going to be evident in what we've seen in the past.
And I think it's two things, as you're saying that pop out to me as being potentially valuable. One would be this idea of being willing to hold two things in your mind at the same time and see how you could play them both, even if they work in opposite directions. The other would be this idea of maybe don't boil things down too much, which I think, as this certainly is not any anti-social media thing. We know that there is a need to boil things down.
Sure.
As you have all of the ways that information is being transmitted are moved in the direction of you got to do it fast, right? But that does potentially cause us problems even with good stats. And one of the things I thought was so fascinating when I worked through it today is Kyren Williams. And I mentioned him in part because you had mentioned him, and I know a lot of people don't see him as being very explosive, which I think is true and is fair. But his profile is so unique in that he's a guy right now, he's leading the NFL in rushing EP per game. He's got the most total EP at the running back position. He's outperformed that by 8 fantasy points. And that's a little bit weird because he's averaging 3.8 yards per carry. He's got a low evasion rate. It was surprising to me and interesting that he and David Montgomery, again, by the SAS stats, are the two backs who are averaging at least 2.5 yards after contact, a decent number, with an evasion rate below 10. Right? We certainly wouldn't look at David Montgomery and be like, well, he's not, moving guys, because he does move them. There's also this ability to do very small things, even if you don't always get credit for them. So among backs with at least 50 carries, and there are 28 players who qualify for that, he ranks 4th in first down percentage. He's got the 7th best stuff percentage, despite being in the middle of the pack in terms of hit at the line percentage. Obviously, if you're being hit more, it's going to be more difficult to do some of those things. And in concert with that, he's kept up this really high touchdown pace. Now, certainly I think it's completely fair to say that the touchdown pace in many ways is the responsibility, or the credit goes to the coach, the QB, the scheme, how they're doing those types of things. But then with that, right, you have this really high rush share to this point, which is going to help you score touchdowns if you're always out there on the field. But the Rams have had the 4th hardest running back strength of schedule to this point. They have the 4th easiest remaining. And yet the other thing there, talking about keeping things, two things in mind at the same time, even if they're competing, is that we did finally see Blake Corum. And so I think that Blake Corum is also a very interesting play when we think about relative price to what happens if he does form a committee. It's going to be not great at all for Kyren Williams, especially Kyren Williams, I believe, is leading the NFL in routes at the running back position, but he also has
playing like every snap. He's playing so many snaps.
And yeah, so those things are being connected. You wouldn't always have to go out in the routes, but they're also not passing to him at all. His yards per route, incredibly low. So you have all these unique contradictory elements to his profile. I mean, if you have an injury, Corum is probably going to take over and be one of the best plays. And so so many interesting things going on there that are not going to necessarily show up if you boil them down to a single stat that purports to show a certain type of efficiency. Even if the efficiency stat is fantastic, knowing some of that nuance is going to be helpful for you as you think through it. And you don't have to agree with our take on it. You don't have to agree with the community's take on it. You don't have to agree with your favorite analyst's take on it. It's helpful for you as you work through understanding, how you want to play that guy and just how you think about the other running back, individual players, committees, game plans, as they're heading out for these next, what would it be, 12 fantasy football weeks that are still going to decide the season, right? I mean, we all have teams that are in first. We all have teams that are not looking very good and would almost at this point probably have to run the table to get back in it. So you have some teams that are set up better than others, but most of what's going to happen for fantasy is still going to happen, right? It's still out ahead of us. And we want to make sure, again, that we have some nuance and some dynamism to how we're thinking about it. I think especially too, because it's more fun that way, right? Just knowing how a player or a position ranks in like one stat, even if it's the best stat, like, well, now all the rest of the fun has been taken out because you lose all of those additional levels that are also interesting.
Loved all of that. That was fantastic. You mentioned Corum. We saw him move ahead of Ronnie Rivers, who only played on special teams but was active in week 5. They go on bye now. Typically, we see rookies get used a little bit more post-bye, but the fact that Corum moved into 11 snaps. He had some carries a few weeks ago. They were all in garbage time. This time, he was getting some work, even in the green zone, in the flow of the game, which was nice to see. Still only played about 15% of the snaps. Kyron played significantly more. As you're talking about a lot of the things that are still left to come, Kendre Miller is set to be activated from IR soon, somebody that we've been picking up and stashing for weeks now. That Saints really run-heavy offense that's been working very well for Kamara, but Kamara not necessarily actually adding a ton. Looks like something that could be very favorable for Kendre Miller. I've hypothesized that, yes, we know the coach hates him. Everyone want to talk about that, but also that some of that with him getting hurt right away in camp may have just been a little bit of disappointment because they actually really did want to use him and they were frustrated because they haven't.
It's like when your favorite TV show announces that the next season is going to be 6 months delayed.
7
you're not
years
happy about
delayed.
That.
Sean, our favorite Severance has been delayed for freaking like how long?
January,
it's
Ben.
Coming.
It's coming out.
I know. We've been naming our fantasy teams after quotes from Severance for like 4 years, and season 2 hasn't come out yet. It's crazy. But Kendre Miller, also wanted to mention Kamani Vidal. As we were recording it now, Gus Edwards coming out of a bye, misses the first practice due to an ankle. That's alarming coming out of a full week off. It might just be a veteran rest type thing, but that's usually not what you want off a week off, right? And so kind of wondering if they're using this as an opportunity, again, a post-bye situation for a young back, an opportunity to be like, look, he's not right. We're going to let him sit for a week or a couple weeks. Let's get the young guy activated and maybe use Vidal a little bit this week. He's another one. I've got teams where I got all 3 of those guys stashed, Corum, Vidal, and Kendre. They've been cutting a lot of leagues as well. I got some questions from people that were asking things, Sean, like, are we so one person asked me if it was the sunk cost fallacy to still be holding somebody like a Vidal right now. And I was like, man, we're only through 5 weeks. Like a lot of times you add these guys, you're really thinking about the back-weighted production. You're thinking about things need to progress a certain way. I think there's some positive signs with some of those guys. Look at Tyrone Tracy last week. That's a guy that I actually, in like one of my home leagues, I had cut because he was sort of behind those other guys as a stash maybe at first. That offense didn't look great, etc. Singletary does miss a game, and Tracy has a phenomenal game, 129 rushing yards. And now it looks like he's just going to be a big part of the offense going forward, potentially, as Singletary comes back. Kind of hard to put the toothpaste back in the tube when he has a game like that. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for what Tracy just did with some of these other names that I just mentioned. It's optimistic, but I am optimistic about those players still.
And tactically, how I would think about that is that I'm not cutting those guys for players who have better projections this week if you're not going to start them, right? So there's such a limited number of weeks in fantasy. You do need to win. If you get caught in a situation where you have injury issues or bye week issues and your roster, it's not like a reflection on yourself. If you have a bunch of guys on a bye and a bunch of injuries, if your starting lineup is going to hemorrhage a huge number of projected points, if you don't pick up somebody else and cut one of those guys and plug that guy in immediately so you can win this week, then it's a mistake to not do that. I mean, you need to win this week.
Yep.
You don't want to be picking players up you're not going to play if the player is just a guy, because then you run into the problem of kind of making a double mistake or opening yourself up to being frustrated at least twice, in that you drafted someone, a big part of the thesis was second half of the season, but at least part of the thesis was that it could happen earlier. And so you've lost the part of the thesis where it could happen earlier. And that part is frustrating. It's not like you ignore that and say, oh, it's not a big deal. I don't care. I'm not frustrated. This guy didn't score anything. Yeah. I mean, you wish he had played better, but the most important part of the thesis is the second half. And if you give up too early, especially when you didn't need to, right? So it's a necessity element here. Then you're going to be extremely frustrated that you cut a player that you're going to bid 70% on next week, or that you're simply not going to be able to get if you don't have waiver priority or however your league does it. Don't make a second mistake that's unnecessary just because of frustration right now, knowing that you still may not be right. Just because you don't cut them doesn't mean that, in week 8, week 11, week 15, they're actually going to score for you. They could not score. That's possible, but it also doesn't mean that you should cut everybody because they might not score. So again, you got to juggle multiple things there. I would encourage people to win this week if that's a dynamic that you're placed in.
And you still got to have playable players on your bench to a degree too, because sometimes I get the feedback that if you're, I think the way you said it is really good. And the way that I was about to boil it down is like you worry about the this week's points in your starting lineup and future upside on your bench. But then a lot of people will just take all of the stashed running backs and then they don't have anything on their bench that they can actually play. And that can be a little bit of a problem. And I just mentioned I have a home league team that has all of Corum and Vidal and Kendra Miller stashed, has Bucky Irving on the bench as well. That team's 1-4. Although I just looked, it is 4th in points scored. Like, it does have a pretty good starting lineup. So there's a balance there. At 1-4, I need to be willing to cut those guys to potentially add startable players if it comes to that. Now, at the same time, I'm not going to cut those guys just to have bench players that are potentially plug and play options down the road. I do need to be able to win this week. Like you were saying, I'm 1-4. I need to get that win-loss record going. There is a component in this league where there's an all-play component for the final playoff spot. So I'm probably more aimed toward that at this point with this team. But my starting lineup is fine. And so I'm still stashing these guys. But you do, yeah. I mean, you talked through those trade-offs very well, I thought. There is the situations where you are 1-4, 2-3, and you have all stashes on your bench, and you are probably you're not hurting your lineup necessarily this week, but you're probably hurting your ability to be good in the next 2 to 3 weeks if you're only stashing players that are 4 or 5 weeks away from actually being starters. So there's a little bit of a balance there.
And it's tricky. You can miss the Tyrone Tracy game because it didn't make sense to start him at that point, and then a Devin Singletary comes back. We could get that with Gus Edwards and Kamani Vidal. I guess I wouldn't be as worried about it there because Edwards has been so bad when healthy. And I don't know. The defensive situation for J.K. Dobbins in the last couple of weeks was much more difficult. It does matter for running backs. I guess I have a lot of enthusiasm for him that his workload is now going to be very, very good, even though they have some incentive to manage him a bit, considering all the injury background there.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Yeah, Vidal is still a few things away, probably. It just would be nice to see him active, get an opportunity to behind Dobbins. What you would then need to see is you would need to see him perform. Now, he would also have to be ahead of Hassan Haskins, who has been active and playing on special teams, but I do think it's plausible that if activated, that Vidal would actually play in the offense earlier than Haskins, who's not really cracked the offense, even when they've not had Edwards play a lot. So you need Vidal to then get some opportunity. I think it'd be a lot of Dobbins, and then it would be even if it's 20% or 15% Vidal, you're hoping that you see some burst and you see some potential that then you think the team is going to see, because Edwards has not shown that. And then long term, you're like, well, you might need a Dobbins injury, but if he can show that, then they're going to be like, this gives us a path to not have to use Dobbins too much. And it can be a 60-40 or 55-45, right? Where Vidal's now in a pretty good secondary role. That's the hope for the next 2 to 3 weeks, sort of a thing. But then that also requires them to completely give up on Edwards. So he needs to come take advantage of that opportunity. Yeah, an interesting.
And people are going to say, if he were that good, why would he have been inactive? But you even just think back to the Tyrone Tracy thing. He didn't even start this game. Right? They were going to go with Eric Gray, and then he gets a chance, and like, oh, this guy looks exactly as advertised. So those things are difficult for NFL teams because their decision making is really not based for the most part on like who's going to flash to the fans. It's how do we execute our scheme and win this football game. So there are some mixed incentives there for the coaching staff that it's not, I think, a fair claim to make, even though sometimes it's probably the truth. They're like, you get to see these guys in practice. How do you not know who the best players are? There's a lot going on as they try and run their offense every week.
Yeah, and that's why, I mean, it takes some time with the rookies as well. Sometimes they're just waiting on them. We saw the Corum thing, for example. That's the hope with the Vidal thing. I'm describing something. People might be like, oh, this is all fan fiction, and it's not actually going to happen, and it doesn't happen, and I look like an idiot. It's really easy to be like, yeah, the thing that was the status quo kept going. We're talking about something that can happen. I just want to be clear. And it does happen. And when it does happen, it is meaningful. We saw it with Corum this past week. People were starting to say you need to cut Corum because he's behind Ronnie Rivers. The thought process was he's not actually behind Ronnie Rivers. They just need to get him up to speed on some stuff. And I think on week 4 we saw, or week 5 we saw that he, once ready, was out there ahead of him. Now they're going to the bye. You think post bye, it's definitely Corum as the number 2. And as you alluded to, it might be a way for them to then ease off Kyron's workload, which is something they talked about in the offseason. And we haven't seen through the first 5 games because maybe they didn't think they were ready for, but that could happen post-bye pretty easily. We saw it like with Travis Etienne last year. He was in all the work early, and then they wanted to ease him back later in the season. A lot of teams are aware of these workloads with running backs and those types of things. And you get out of the gate early and you don't feel like you have another option, but then mid-season you hit the bye, you go, we got to figure out another option. And really, week 5 might have been a huge look at for Corum. I wrote it in Stealing Signals. This might be one of the biggest signals in week 5 that Blake Corum just played the snaps as the number 2 and Ronnie Rivers didn't, because it might have a big impact on Kyron. It might have a big impact on Corum. Gus Edwards being out the first day of practice after a bye may be nothing. He may have practiced today as we're recording this. I haven't seen the practice report. It may also be that really big first signal that we're going to hold him out this week, and we're going to play Kamani Vidal, and we're actually going to let him play a little bit and see what he has.
Yeah, I think people are going to like what they see when they get Kamani on the field. Ben, this has been so much fun. I love these midweek Stealing Bananas, talking about as a fan myself of the things that I get to do during the week. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me as always is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch, at Stealing Signals, Stealing Lines, get that betting info. Make sure you have subscribed to Stealing Signals YouTube and click notifications so you know when Ben goes live. Oh, one of the things that we did want to note, Ben, just schedule and other things. We've been trying a variety of things throughout the season. We're going to take this Sunday night off from the live show. And so don't be looking for that one. We will still bring you plenty of fun content through the rest of the year. If you want to subscribe to RotoViz because you liked any of those advanced stats, the coupon code RVRadio 2024 at checkout for 10% off your 1-year subscription. If you already have subscribed to RV, to Stealing Signals, and you want to know how you can help us, every little thing you do with a rating and review, all those tiny types of interactions do help us with the algorithms. And the algorithms then decide whether or not people listen to your show. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.